Thanks for watching my mini lesson. I just want to take a few minutes and talk about the purpose of the U.S. Census. Now, if we were in a classroom or in Adobe Classroom, I'd want to start with an open discussion about what is the Constitution. Get some student input, work with a little bit of a definition, talk about why we have three branches of government. That the Constitution sets up the framework of our government, that it divides three branches, that it's a document with 7 different articles outlining the roles of those different branches. And then once we start talking about why we have 3 branches, I want to talk a little bit about the legislature, why we have a legislative branch, the nature of it. Eventually in that conversation, it'll come up about the Senate and the House of Representatives, and that we have this bicameral system, that we live in a representative democracy. So working from that conversation with the representative democracy, let's talk about the Constitution. Let's talk about those 7 articles. And let's focus in on Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution. The actual enumeration shall be made within 3 years after the first meeting of the Congress of the United States, and within every subsequent term of 10 years, in such manner as they shall by law direct. Article 1 is by far the longest and most detailed, and there's a reason for that. The founders were very particular about what it was that they wanted the legislative branch to do, but this line about an enumeration, this need to count the population, is really important to understand when we look at the role of our republic, that we live in a system where it's important that our legislators reflect the population. But for the attendees of the Philadelphia Convention, they didn't know how that reflection was going to work. There were 2 main plans presented, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. And the Virginia plan called for having a bicameral legislature, but where the states would have votes representative of their population. Translation meaning that big states would have more votes than small states. This worked out great if you were from a big state. You would have a lot of vote. You would have a lot of sway. If you were from a small state, you wouldn't. And it's important that we keep in mind what's going on in 1787. The Constitution is being written because the previous government system wasn't working. And I'm not talking about being a British colony. The Articles of Confederation, that stopgap between the end of the Revolution, or actually even it was written before the end of the Revolution, up until the Constitution is written and ratified, with the Articles of Confederation, the first attempt at getting these 13 separate colonies to come together and work together as a new nation, and it just wasn't strong enough. But the colonists, the new Americans, had a hard time breaking with their statehood. This idea that I'm a Virginian first and an American second, as Patrick Henry once said. So they needed to find a way to come together. But they still had a lot of individual ties and commitments to what was going on in their home, in their state. So the Virginian plan was a reflection of that the people of the bigger states wanted to make sure that their interests were protected because they had more people. The smaller states took the view that you might have more people, but we're all equal states. We should have an equal representation. So the New Jersey plan was presented that called for having one House of Legislation, a unicameral system, where each state had an equal number of votes. You can see why the big states wouldn't love this plan. So this became a hot issue that summer, but it was resolved by our favorite cobbler from Connecticut, Roger Sherman, with what became known as the Great Compromise, which is what we have now, a bicameral system, one house reflective of the population, the House of Representatives, and the other where all the states have equal votes, the Senate. 2 states per state. The number varies depending on your population. Well, how do we determine the population? That's where the census comes in. Every 10 years, the Census Bureau sends out census takers and records where everyone lives, how many people there are, because if we know how many people there are in each state, we can reapportion every 10 years and decide how many members of the House of Representatives each state should. Originally, the House of Representatives just grew at first every 10 years, from the 1790 census to the 1800 census to the 1810 census. They just added more congressmen, but you can see how this is going to become a problem as the number of people increases. So eventually the number is capped at 435, and that 435 is reapportioned or shuffled around following the census every 10 years, which is how Arizona has gone from 2 congressmen to 8 as our population grows. That gives some states the feeling of having more weight than others, but the goal is that between the Senate and the House, there will be a fair reflection of what the people need and what is best for the country. Why does it matter? Well, because the census is actually a really big deal and a highly politicized deal. From the very beginning, it's been a hot issue. In fact, it's it's also where we see one of America's most embarrassing issues, because at that same convention where the Great Compromise was proposed, they reached another compromise, the Three-Fifths Compromise. You see, a lot of the big states had a big population that they didn't consider citizens. They were slaveholding states. And they wanted to count their slaves as part of their population to increase their number of votes in Congress. Small states didn't want that, for the moral reasons, but also because that was going against what they wanted, which was to be more equally represented. So the smaller states said, no, if you're not treating them as citizens, they're not technically people in your view, or in many of the Northerners' view as well, you can't count them. And the Southerners claimed they live here and we're going to count them. So eventually they reached this view that they would be counted as 3/5 of a whole person, which would bump up the number of representatives that the Southern state could have, but it wasn't giving them that full number as if they could count their slaves as people. So that was the Three-Fifths Compromise. In the language of Article 2, it also clarifies that Indians are exempt from the population, another group of people that the founders didn't consider citizens. Now, the contention around the census isn't limited back to the summer of 1877. It comes up contentious now as well. There's lots of problems with the census. The logistics of having a government worker go to everyone's home and count them, you can imagine what a chore that is. So there's lots of arguments every time the census comes up about whether or not there isn't some kind of algorithm or mathematic formula that can be used. There's also some issues about how to count people that aren't home, like the homeless, immigrant populations, migrant populations, and prisons. I'll talk about prisons for just a second. Prison populations are counted as residents of the county that the prison is in, but you know how it goes. You get sent to prison. Prisoners aren't from that area, and so they're being counted in the area where the prison is, skews the vote of that county, and also misrepresents the place where they are from. So there's still a lot of problems going on with this. But really, why does it matter? It matters because of the Electoral College. We don't live in a direct democracy. We don't really live in a pure democracy. We live in a republic democracy, in a representative democracy, and we do not elect the president. The president is elected by the Electoral College. The number of votes your state gets in the Electoral College is your number of representatives in Congress, plus your 2 senators. So states with a bigger population get more votes in the Electoral College, which is how every 4 years we end up seeing the same kind of pictures. You'll recognize them, the same kind of conversations, and the same talk about electoral math. The number of representatives your state gets in the House of Representatives increases the number of representatives you get in the Electoral College, which is why states like Ohio or Michigan or Florida get a lot of attention in election years, because they have a lot of electoral votes. That's why we pay attention to what happens in California and Texas, and less about what's going on in Wyoming or Alaska. Because the number of people influences how they're voted. That's why certain states get marketed to. Certain states are campaign stops. Other states are flyovers. So while the census isn't the biggest issue in American government, it is highly politicized. How the census is done is a big deal. How the districts are drawn is a big deal. And if we were going to continue this lesson, we'd want to now take time to talk about gerrymandering. Take a look at the 1812 Massachusetts map. Talk about how representation works within different areas, and talk about how we can spread that out. So this is really just a springboard for that conversation. There's a couple of readings I'd like to assign with it, a lot of political cartoons that really help understand both sides of the census, of representation, and the goal of representatives in a democracy and in a republic. Thanks so much for watching my mini lesson.